The rain hammered the streets of Rome just before dawn on October 12th, turning the ancient city into a maze of glistening stone and silent shadows. While nearly everyone remained asleep, 4 unmarked Vatican security vehicles rolled quietly toward the massive iron gates of the Palazzo della Cancelleria. Behind those historic walls lived some of the most influential bishops and cardinals in the Roman Curia, men who for centuries had occupied lavish Renaissance apartments without paying a single euro. Their extraordinary privilege dated back to a papal decree issued nearly 500 years earlier, granting senior church leaders luxurious residences free from rent, taxes, or financial scrutiny. Within the Vatican, this arrangement had become known as the Palatine privilege, a tradition considered so sacred that few believed it could ever be challenged. Yet before sunrise, that centuries-old system was about to collapse. 3 Vatican officers stepped from the lead vehicle, unlocked the gates with high-level authorization codes, and crossed the marble courtyard, carrying sealed parchment envelopes stamped with the personal seal of Pope Leo XIV. These were not routine notices or administrative letters. Each envelope contained a personal papal decree issued entirely on the Pope's own authority, bypassing every committee and council within the Vatican. On the 3rd floor, Archbishop Lorenzo Vella was awakened by loud, deliberate knocks on his heavy wooden door. Annoyed by the interruption, he wrapped himself in an expensive silk robe and expected to find a nervous assistant outside. Instead, a Vatican commander silently handed him the sealed document and calmly stated that it came directly from the Holy Father and was effective immediately. As Vella broke the wax seal and read the opening lines, the color drained from his face. The decree declared that the Palatine privilege no longer existed. Every Vatican-owned residence would now be valued according to the commercial property market, and every cleric, regardless of rank, would be required to pay full market rent if they wished to remain. Those unable or unwilling to pay would have only 14 days to vacate. There would be no appeals, no exemptions, and no negotiations. 5 centuries of guaranteed luxury had ended with a single signature. Shock quickly turned into outrage. Vella insisted there had to be some terrible mistake and demanded to speak with higher authorities, convinced that no pope would authorize such a sweeping decision without consultation. The commander offered no explanation. He simply acknowledged the order, turned away, and departed. Furious, Vella immediately reached for his secure telephone and attempted to contact Cardinal Giovanni Battista, one of the most powerful figures in the Roman Curia and a longtime defender of the Church's traditional privileges. To his surprise, every attempt failed. What he did not yet know was that identical scenes were unfolding across Rome. In prestigious neighborhoods throughout the city, dozens of Vatican teams were delivering the same decree to more than 100 bishops, cardinals, and senior officials at precisely the same moment. The operation had been organized in complete secrecy, using only a tiny circle of trusted advisors and the chief of Vatican security. No rumors had leaked, and no warning had been given. As confusion spread through the city, Pope Leo XIV was already seated in his modest office inside the Domus Sanctae Marthae. Unlike many of the officials affected by his decision, he lived simply and avoided the grandeur associated with high-ranking church offices. While reviewing financial reports over a plain cup of black coffee, he examined years of audits showing millions of euros spent maintaining luxurious residences that produced no income while the church continued asking believers around the world to donate money for charitable work. To Leo, the contradiction had become impossible to ignore. Rather than introducing gradual reforms that could be delayed or weakened by endless debate, he chose decisive action. By early morning, panic swept through the Vatican's internal communication system. Cardinals flooded one another with urgent messages, bishops contacted canon lawyers, and senior officials desperately searched for a way to stop the decree before the outside world discovered what had happened. Many believed the Pope had gone too far, but none of them realized that the carefully planned operation had already advanced far beyond anything they could immediately challenge. Meanwhile, several of the Vatican's most influential Italian cardinals secretly gathered inside an elegant private residence overlooking Rome's Pantheon. Seated around an antique wooden table, they believed they still had enough political influence to overturn the Pope's order. Leading the discussion was Cardinal Giovanni Battista, a veteran strategist who had successfully navigated decades of Vatican politics under multiple pontificates. Calm and confident, he assured the others that Pope Leo's dramatic move would ultimately fail. In his view, the Decreia could be buried beneath years of legal arguments within the Apostolic Signatura, the Vatican's highest judicial authority. Their lawyers would challenge the order using centuries of precedent, arguing that such an abrupt cancellation of long-standing privileges violated established canon law. If they delayed the process long enough, they believed the Pope would eventually be forced into compromise. Convinced the Church's complex bureaucracy would once again protect its most powerful members, they confidently drafted legal petitions while sipping espresso and discussing their strategy. Yet they had badly underestimated the preparation behind Pope Leo's decision. Long before issuing the decree, he had quietly studied every legal argument his opponents might attempt to use. At precisely 8 o'clock that morning, while the cardinals were finalizing their appeal, the Vatican press office released a second document that completely transformed the situation. This new directive revealed that 48 hours before the early morning operation, Pope Leo had already transferred the legal management of every Vatican residential property into a newly established independent trust, operating outside the direct jurisdiction of Vatican City. It was a carefully engineered legal maneuver that stunned even experienced canon lawyers, since the properties were now governed under Italian civil property law rather than internal Vatican administration. The Church's own courts no longer had authority over housing disputes. The cardinals suddenly discovered that canon law could not protect their residences. If they wished to challenge rent increases or eviction notices, they would have to appear before Italy's public civil courts as ordinary private citizens. Such lawsuits would inevitably expose their financial records, personal assets, and hidden sources of wealth to journalists and the public. The legal shield they had relied upon for generations had disappeared overnight. Pope Leo had effectively removed every internal path of resistance before anyone realized what he had done. The princes of the Church now faced only two choices: quietly pay full market rent from their own legitimate resources, or fight publicly and risk revealing financial secrets that could permanently damage their reputations. News of the second decree spread through the Vatican like wildfire. The realization that every possible legal escape had already been blocked left senior officials stunned. By midday, confidential communication networks were overwhelmed as anxious clergy exchanged encrypted messages trying to understand how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. Even many reform-minded bishops who had supported Leo's election were astonished by the speed and precision of his actions. They had expected gradual reforms, not a complete restructuring of one of the Vatican's oldest systems within a single morning. Later that afternoon, Pope Leo invited Cardinal Pietro Parolin, his Secretary of State, to a private meeting inside the modest Domus Sanctae Marthae. Known for his diplomatic approach and preference for quiet negotiation, Parolin arrived visibly exhausted after spending hours responding to growing international concern. Respectfully, he suggested that the Pope issue a softer public statement or perhaps allow elderly cardinals additional time before enforcing the new policy. He warned that pushing influential members of the Curia too aggressively could create dangerous divisions inside the Church. Leo listened carefully without interrupting. After a long silence, he asked a single question. He wanted to know exactly how much money the Vatican had spent renovating the Palazzo della Cancelleria during the previous year. Parolin reluctantly admitted the figure exceeded 4 million euros. The Pope then asked how much funding had been provided to the newly established shelter for homeless families near Rome's Termini station. The answer was only a fraction of that amount. Leaning forward, Leo quietly explained that the issue was no longer about politics or diplomacy, but about living according to the gospel. The Church, he said, could not continue preaching humility and sacrifice while its own leaders enjoyed extraordinary luxury funded by the institution itself. The decree would remain unchanged, there would be no delay, and the Vatican press office should publicly confirm every detail without hesitation. Parolin understood that the discussion was over. The Pope had made his decision, and nothing within the traditional machinery of the Curia would alter it. As the afternoon wore on, the impact of Pope Leo's reforms became impossible to ignore. The frantic phone calls, secret meetings, and legal discussions that had consumed the Vatican since sunrise gradually faded into an uneasy silence. Senior Church officials finally accepted that the Pope had anticipated every possible objection before issuing his decree. A tradition that had survived wars, political upheavals, and centuries of papal leadership had been dismantled in less than a single day. Yet inside the modest dining room of the Domus Sanctae Marthae, Pope Leo showed no signs of celebration. He quietly ate a simple meal of soup and bread while his young chief of protocol, Father Thomas, stood nearby holding a tablet overflowing with international news alerts. Newspapers and television networks across the world had begun reporting the dramatic events unfolding inside Vatican City. Headlines described the unprecedented decision as the end of centuries of privilege, while journalists from New York, Paris, London, and Manila urgently requested official explanations. Father Thomas informed the Pope that nearly every major media organization wanted to know one thing above all else: where would the money collected from the new rental system actually go? Leo calmly placed his spoon on the table and answered without hesitation. Every euro received from those properties, he explained, would be directed entirely toward helping the poor through shelters, food programs, medical clinics, and charitable services in Rome and beyond. The reform, he insisted, was never about punishment or revenge. It was about ensuring that church resources served those most in need, rather than maintaining luxurious lifestyles for a privileged few. Father Thomas then shared another concern. Rumors were spreading that several cardinals intended to ignore the decree completely, believing the Pope would eventually back down rather than force senior members of the Church from their homes. Leo's expression remained steady as he responded that there was no bluff involved. If rent remained unpaid after the deadline, utilities would be disconnected just as they would be for any ordinary tenant. Should anyone continue refusing to comply, further legal action would follow without exception. Looking toward the dome of St. Muelferretan, Peter's Basilica through the nearby window, he quietly remarked that the church was never meant to function as a palace for powerful men, but as a place of hope for those who had nothing. Those who had enjoyed centuries of comfort, he said, now needed to rediscover the true meaning of service. While these events unfolded inside Vatican City, Archbishop Lorenzo Vella spent the afternoon desperately searching for outside support. He reached out to influential contacts within the Italian government, hoping political pressure might persuade the Vatican to reconsider its decision. His efforts achieved nothing. Unknown to him, Pope Leo had coordinated the legal restructuring of the residential properties with Italian authorities well before announcing the reform. Many officials in Rome had quietly welcomed the move, viewing it as a long overdue step toward greater financial transparency. By mid-afternoon, another devastating blow arrived. Couriers delivered formal legal notices prepared by the newly created trust responsible for managing the former Vatican residences. Unlike traditional church documents, written in ceremonial language, these papers were straightforward commercial contracts governed by Italian civil law. They listed each property's market valuation, the exact monthly rent required to remain in residence, and detailed payment instructions. When Vella read the figures assigned to his apartment, he was stunned. The monthly rent reached nearly 15,000 euros, an amount impossible to justify without exposing the personal wealth he had carefully kept hidden for years. One by one, the traditionalists realized they had reached the end of every possible avenue. They could not appeal to the Pope because he himself had designed the reform. They could not rely on Vatican courts because those courts no longer had authority over the properties. And they certainly could not expect public sympathy, as many ordinary Catholics viewed the changes as a long overdue correction of institutional excess. In a final effort to preserve at least some dignity, Cardinal Giovanni Battista requested a private audience with Pope Leo, hoping direct negotiation might produce a compromise or gradual transition. The response arrived quickly from the papal household. The message was brief and unmistakable. The Holy Father's schedule would not permit such a meeting, and all matters concerning residential properties were to be handled exclusively through the legal representatives of the independent trust. With that single reply, the remaining hopes of reversing the reform disappeared. The era of inherited privilege had officially come to an end, and for the first time in their careers, many of the Vatican's most powerful figures discovered what it meant to stand before the law not as princes of the Church, but simply as ordinary tenants. As the days passed and the payment deadline drew closer, the atmosphere surrounding the Vatican continued to change. Reporters from around the world gathered outside several historic residences, eager to witness the consequences of Pope Leo's sweeping reform. Inside the Roman Curia, uncertainty replaced confidence as senior clergy quietly weighed their limited options. Some reluctantly accepted the new reality and arranged to cover the required rent through legitimate diocesan support or other approved financial sources. Others struggled with the decision, knowing that any attempt to challenge the reform publicly could attract an even greater attention. The era of unquestioned housing privileges had clearly come to an end, and everyone understood that the Pope had no intention of reversing course. Throughout Rome, conversations shifted from disbelief to acceptance as people realized the reform was being enforced exactly as announced. What had once seemed impossible was now becoming the new normal, and many younger priests viewed the changes as the beginning of a more transparent chapter in the Church's administration. As the first payment deadline arrived, Vatican financial officials carefully reviewed the status of every residence affected by the decree. Most of the clergy quietly complied with the new policy, choosing to adapt rather than create further controversy. A smaller number, however, delayed payment or failed to respond altogether. In accordance with the published regulations, administrative measures were initiated against those properties. Certain residential services were suspended in line with standard legal procedures, reinforcing the message that every occupant would now be treated under the same rules, regardless of position or influence. The process unfolded calmly, without dramatic confrontations, yet its symbolic impact was enormous. Images of senior church officials relocating from long-occupied residences soon appeared across international media, sparking widespread discussion about accountability, financial responsibility, and institutional reform. For supporters of the Pope's vision, the moment represented a powerful commitment to consistency between the Church's teachings and its administration. Inside the Domus Sanctae Marthae, Pope Leo remained focused on his work rather than the growing attention surrounding the reform. Reports from around the world continued arriving on his desk, but he showed little interest in public praise or criticism. To him, the housing reform was only one element of a broader effort to strengthen transparency and ensure that church resources served their intended mission. He believed leadership required difficult decisions, especially when long-standing customs no longer reflected the values they were meant to support. While some continued debating the wisdom of his actions, others saw the changes as a historic turning point that would influence future generations of church leadership. Whether admired or questioned, the reform had already reshaped the conversation throughout the Vatican, demonstrating that even traditions preserved for centuries could be reconsidered when a leader believed meaningful change was necessary. As the weeks passed, the effects of the reform became increasingly visible throughout Rome. Several historic residences that had long symbolized privilege slowly emptied as their occupants made arrangements to relocate. The quiet departure of senior clergy attracted significant public attention, with journalists and photographers documenting the historic transition. For many observers, the images represented more than a simple change of address. They reflected a broader shift in the Church's approach to leadership and responsibility. Across social media and international news outlets, discussions centered on whether this marked the beginning of a new era of accountability within the Vatican. While some critics questioned the speed of the reforms, many believers praised the effort to align administrative practices more closely with the values of humility and service. Behind closed doors, church officials carefully reviewed the financial adjustments required under the new system, ensuring that every transaction followed updated standards of transparency and proper oversight. Recognizing that financial accountability would be essential to the credibility of the reform, Pope Leo introduced additional measures designed to strengthen oversight of church resources. Updated review procedures required that payments connected to the residential program meet established financial regulations and internal compliance standards. Rather than targeting individuals, the new framework focused on promoting transparency and responsible stewardship across the institution. These policies reinforced the message that every member of the Church, regardless of rank, would be expected to follow the same financial principles. As confidence in the reforms gradually grew, many younger priests and bishops began viewing the changes as an opportunity to restore public trust and demonstrate a renewed commitment to the Church's pastoral mission. When the first review period concluded, it became clear that the transition was moving forward despite the early resistance. Most of the affected residences had successfully shifted into the new management system, and the atmosphere within the Vatican slowly changed from uncertainty to cautious acceptance. Pope Leo remained focused on the larger purpose behind the reform rather than the public attention it generated. In his view, lasting renewal depended not on preserving long-standing privileges, but on ensuring that the Church's resources were managed responsibly and directed towards serving people in need. As the institution adapted to its new reality, many observers recognized that the changes extended far beyond housing policy. They reflected a broader vision of leadership built on accountability, simplicity, and service, principles that would continue shaping discussions inside and outside the Vatican for years. With the transition largely complete, the former residences entered a new chapter. Instead of remaining symbols of exclusive privilege, the properties were gradually integrated into programs intended to strengthen the Church's charitable mission and community outreach. Revenue generated through the updated housing system was directed toward projects supporting vulnerable families, healthcare initiatives, educational assistance, and humanitarian services in Rome and other regions. What had once represented centuries of institutional tradition was now being reshaped into a practical resource for serving those most in need. Many Catholics around the world viewed the transformation as a powerful reminder that church property could become an active instrument of compassion rather than simply preserving historical customs. Although opinions about the reforms remained divided, few could deny that they had permanently changed the conversation surrounding leadership, stewardship, and financial responsibility inside the Vatican. For many of the senior clergy affected by the changes, the months that followed became a period of adjustment. Simpler living arrangements replaced the expansive residences they had occupied for years, while the daily routines of church administration continued under the new policies. At the same time, younger priests and bishops increasingly embraced the renewed emphasis on humility, transparency, and responsible management. They believed the reforms reflected an effort to strengthen public confidence by ensuring that institutional decisions remained closely connected to the Church's spiritual mission. Gradually, the initial controversy gave way to broader discussions about how tradition and renewal could coexist without losing sight of the values at the heart of Christian service. The reforms became less about individual personalities and more about the direction the institution intended to follow in the years ahead. Near the end of the year, Pope Leo quietly visited one of the charitable facilities supported through the Church's expanding outreach efforts. Choosing a simple arrival without public ceremony, he spent time speaking with volunteers, greeting families, and encouraging those involved in serving the community. For him, the visit reflected the deeper purpose behind every administrative decision that had sparked so much international attention. Buildings, finances, and long-standing customs, he believed, were meaningful only when they ultimately benefited people. As news of the visit spread, Many observers viewed it as a symbolic conclusion to a remarkable period of reform. Whether celebrated as a bold renewal or debated as a dramatic departure from tradition, the changes had already left a lasting mark on the Vatican. More importantly, they reinforced a message that leadership is measured not by privilege or influence, but by integrity, responsibility, and a genuine commitment to serving others to come.